David Shambaugh, welcome back to China-US Focus. You are, of course, the director of the China Policy Program at George Washington University, but you're also the author of the new book, Where Great Powers Meet, which is published by Oxford University Press. We're thrilled to have you here with us, and I suppose the first question will be about the US and China in the context of Southeast Asia. How much of that writing is on the wall, and if you can perhaps speak about the wider book and what you hope to bring through it.
Yeah, the book is entitled Where Great Powers Meet, America and China in Southeast Asia. So let me open maybe with sort of an overview first of how I got into this book project, what brought it about. Secondly, what are the main sort of conclusions, takeaways that I have found in the study. And then maybe thirdly, talk a little bit about the future of the US-China competition in Southeast Asia. And then you and I can have a conversation about all that. But maybe I'll just open up with an overview of those three things. So the project itself, I have to say, was somewhat new territory for me, both analytically and physically. Analytically, I've worked on China's foreign relations with many different parts of the world. In fact, my previous book, China Goes Global, literally dealt with the entire world. But I've worked on US-China relations, China-Europe relations quite a lot. This was the first time, though, that I've ever kind of systematically studied China in Southeast Asia. And I had not really spent that much time previously in Southeast Asia myself. So I decided that since I do study US-China relations, I would take that template, you might say, and apply it to Southeast Asia. So that was the origins of the book. As I say, it started in 2017. Then I went back in 2018 for another 3 months, again based in Singapore. Now, the other couple of other things to say about the book briefly is it's not just about China and Southeast Asia. It's very much a book about the United States and China in Southeast Asia. So it looks really at both of the powers individually and then interactively with the 10 member states of ASEAN. And third sort of caveat is that this is not just a book about contemporary affairs. Yes, it is that too, and readers will be able to get a pretty deep understanding of where things are in the region today and where they've been in recent last couple of decades, but it's also very much a book of history. So then the last thing to say about the book is that it proceeds from the analytical premise, and I believe in general, that the United States and China are now locked into indefinite, comprehensive competition across all functional domains and every region of the world. That is the new normal, you might say. It is the overriding, defining characteristic of international relations in the world today. There are many other characteristics, but I would say that that is the most important. And it affects every country on the planet and many different dimensions: diplomacy, commerce, security, ideology, values, science and technology, education and research, public diplomacy, soft power, culture, global governance, media, and other areas. So the US and China are in competition. Not necessarily confrontation. Some elements, yes, confrontation. Some elements, more cooperation. Not many, but some. But competition is the primary characteristic of the US-China relationship and of international affairs, I would argue, in general. So the book proceeds from that premise, and it applies that template, if you will, or that analytical paradigm to Southeast Asia, okay? So that brings me to what are the main findings of my book. Well, first finding is that Southeast Asia is very important in its own right. And we should not look at it as simply a sort of area for great power competition, kind of petri dish in which the major powers are contesting each other. Southeast Asia is a very diverse, culturally rich, ethnically diverse, economically important, strategically important region in its own right. It is the world's sixth largest economy. If you add all the 10 ASEAN countries together, it has almost $3 trillion economy in 2018. It has 636 million people living in the region. It is, as I say, an extraordinarily diverse, culturally, religiously, politically even. There are no fewer than 5 different types of political systems amongst 10 countries. Everything about Southeast Asia is diverse. Therefore, it's impossible to generalize about Southeast Asia. This is one of the first lessons you learn when you're doing research in the region. You've really got to go country by country, and even within countries, there's diversity. Second big takeaway is that the competition between Washington and Beijing, the US and China, is what I call a soft rivalry. They're definitely in competition, and there is a rivalry, but it's not a hard rivalry. What do I mean by soft and hard rivalry? Well, in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, that was a hard rivalry where it was a kind of action-reaction, tit-for-tat kind of relationship and competition. You know, if Moscow did A, Washington did B to counter it, and then Moscow would do C to counter Washington, and Washington would do D to counter Moscow. So it was a very reactive kind of Cold War. Beijing and Washington are both pursuing, I found, their own policies, their own actions in Southeast Asia. And they may be looking over their shoulder, at the other power, and they are. They're both paying close attention to the other power, but they're not premising their actions and their policies based on the other power. In other words, what the US is doing in Southeast Asia is not all about China. And what China's doing is not all about the United States. Now, it may get to that point, but it's not there yet. So I think therefore it distinguishes this rivalry today from the Cold War of yesterday. It's sort of like shadow boxing. These two powers are moving around the region, boxing with each other, but not really in direct contact, you might say. Okay, a third conclusion I find is that they're not the only actors. Washington and Beijing are certainly significant actors, are the biggest powers, but this is a region that is characterized by other, we call them middle powers, right? Japan, Australia, India, even South Korea, and Europe. May surprise your viewers to learn that the largest investors in Southeast Asia is the European Union. And then lastly, my last conclusion, or set of conclusions really, they're kind of counterintuitive conclusions. Now, in this case, the first counterintuitive conclusion pertains to China. So as you travel around Southeast Asia, one is struck on a daily basis really by this pervasive narrative in the regional media, and indeed in talking to many Southeast Asians, that China is already the dominant power in the region. Secondly, that is a kind of natural state of affairs. Thirdly, that all the regional states are being sucked into kind of a China's sphere of influence, a new tribute system. And then fourthly, that this trend is going to continue, and everybody should get on the Beijing bandwagon. That's the pervasive narrative. So I find that, in fact, China has many weaknesses in the region. And I find the United States has many strengths that are not recognized. So I called China an overestimated power, and I described the United States as an underappreciated power in the region. So I have several chapters in the book. A lot of the book kind of goes through category by category, comparing the US and China's different elements of power, different instruments of power, what I call their toolbox. And I find actually that the US toolbox is stronger than China's. That may surprise you, and it may surprise your viewers. And frankly, it surprised me. Now, there are some areas, commerce in particular, in the economic domain, where China is definitely the stronger power, $587 billion of trade in 2018. This year, 2020, we're almost finished, it looks like it'll exceed 600 billion. And in the first quarter of this year, ASEAN became China's leading trading partner, supplanting the European Union. So sure, when it comes to trade, it's massive. And China's commercial footprint in the region is really massive. But the American commercial footprint is not small. It's $350 billion. That's not insignificant. And when you look, interestingly, James, at foreign direct investment, this will surprise you and your viewers. The total stock, this is my favorite statistic, I did not expect. The total stock of American FDI in Southeast Asia is greater not only than China, it's greater than China, Japan, and South Korea combined. Okay? That's total stock. Even on an annual basis in 2018, the American investment in Southeast Asia was twice as much as China's, 24.9 billion to 12.9 billion. So as I dug around, I found that, in fact, China's position in the region is rather uneven. Soft power, just as elsewhere in the world, China has some serious soft power problems, soft power deficit, you might say. Security assistance programs. China's military doesn't do that much in the region in terms of providing assistance to other countries. Cambodia, yes. Myanmar, yes. Thailand, increasingly. That's about it. It is dwarfed by the United States. What the Americans do in terms of security assistance for regional militaries. China's security assistance, not very broad, not very deep. Soft power, not very broad, not very deep. Its so-called United Front activities towards the Huachao is viewed very suspiciously. So, and even the BRI, which most Southeast Asian countries actually see as a good thing. So don't get me wrong there. I think most of them are positive about the BRI. They want to benefit from the infrastructure and other dimensions of it. But a number of these countries have been having difficulties with the BRI in recent years, as Mike Lampton's book and others have indicated. So if you go across the region, I found, in fact, a very different reality than the media narrative that I gave you a minute ago. I found, in fact, a lot of a very pervasive ambivalence, anxiety, and suspicion of China in the region here. Then finally, what about the U.S.? What conclusions did I find there? Well, first, that the U.S. also has its weaknesses. Distance is one of them. It's a long way from the United States to Southeast Asia. And as a result, American diplomacy is episodic at best in the region. And America's had a kind of on-again, off-again approach to Southeast Asia. American public diplomacy in the region, American public diplomacy needs to do a much better job of educating Southeast Asians about the U.S. presence in the region. However, if you look on the other side of the ledger, education, soft power, security assistance, those kinds of areas, I found a lot of strengths. And even, as I say, in commercial investment and trade. So I came out of this project with the kind of surprising conclusions that China's position in the region is not nearly as strong as I had thought it was, and I'd been led to believe when I went into the project by reading. And the U.S. actually has a lot of residual strengths, you might say, that can be built upon. Now they need to be worked on, and you and I can have a conversation about that with regards to the Biden administration. But the U.S. position is not weak. And then, so just to conclude, looking into the future, I guess I foresee a continued soft rivalry in the way I described it. rather than the polarization of the region. The real questions are, number one, will the new Biden administration re-engage with the region? And second question is, will China continue to overreach and overstep and alienate the countries in the region, which is what they've been doing. This is what China's been doing in the last couple of years. So we'll have to watch and see how each of these major powers proceeds. But this is a very fluid dynamic. It's not fixed, it's not static, and it really depends on the agency of all the actors, most importantly of which is Southeast Asia itself.
David Shambaugh, thanks very much for speaking with us there about your new book, Where Great Powers Meet. On the cover, on the jacket of your book, is this great image of the eagle, the American eagle, and of course this Chinese dragon. And in between is the title of your book. Do you think that there is a point where they do meet, or do you think that this is the Great Faceoff, where conflict will inevitably emerge?
No, I don't think conflict will inevitably emerge. I describe in the book what I call competitive coexistence. That's what I see the current situation as being. The two countries are competing comprehensively, strategically, but in commercial domain, diplomacy, many other areas. But that doesn't necessarily have to lead to confrontation, either in Southeast Asia or anywhere else. Competition can be confined, can be bounded. It doesn't have to lead to confrontation. So the big challenge for the US and China, not just in Southeast Asia, but in general, is to manage competition so that it does not become confrontation or even a war, okay? So, competition is not a code word for confrontation or for containment. I think maybe some of your viewers may think that Americans use the word competition, to mean containment or to mean a confrontation. No, we don't. That's not what we're talking about. Competition is a very normal thing. You have competition in the marketplace, right? Companies compete with each other for market share. We have competition in the classroom, what we call the marketplace of ideas. We have competition in sports, right? Competition is in the DNA of societies, including international relations. So that's what I see the US-China. We are in a multifaceted competition with each other in every region of the world: Latin America, Africa, Europe, Middle East, and all throughout Asia, including Southeast Asia. So this book simply tries to take a telescope, and zero in on the Southeast Asian region and to unpack the elements of that competition. But no, I don't see it as, inevitable confrontation. I certainly hope not. There are even areas of potential cooperation in the region. With regards to the environment, the lower Mekong, with regards to development assistance programs, with regards to counterterrorism, with regards to pandemics, okay? Even before COVID, remind you, H1N1 was a Southeast Asian pandemic. With regards to smuggling, human trafficking, there are a whole variety of areas that the US and China have in common, actually. Humanitarian relief that the US and China can work on together in Southeast Asia. So it's not entirely a competitive dynamic, but primarily it is.
What's so fascinating also is your choice of Southeast Asia as a lens into the greater relationship, and not only between the US and China, but the whole global dynamic. Many people think of Asia in terms of Northeast Asia, in terms of the security issues that are inevitably thrown up there. But you've chosen Southeast Asia. Do you think that there are certain countries in that particular region that would stand out, that would be the great meeting places for the great powers?
Well, it's very different than Northeast Asia, as you say, in many regards. I mean, Northeast Asian countries, first of all, are ethnically homogeneous, right? Japan, Korea. The only people you find in Korea are Koreans. The only people you find in Japan are Japanese. Well, you go to Southeast Asian countries, there are multiple ethnicities within each country, multiple religions. Diversity, as I said in my opening remarks, is really the major overriding characteristic of Southeast Asia. And, Northeast Asian economies are really in the top 10 in the world. Southeast Asian economies are all not all of them are newly industrialized. Some of them, Southeast Asia is contrast. Singapore and Brunei are in the top 5 in the world in per capita income. Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar are in the bottom 20, I think, in per capita income in the world. And then you have various middle income countries in between. So again, diversity of Southeast Asia defines it. And each of these countries has their own particular histories, colonial histories with China, histories with each other. This is not a homogeneous region, by the way. And there are a number of secessionist movements that are still ongoing in the southern Philippines, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and in Myanmar. So at least 4 of the 10 countries today, as we sit here, James, are having serious secessionist problems, been going on for a long time. So, again, I don't think the major power interaction is the only intellectual frame to understand Southeast Asia through. It's a frame, and it's increasingly important. And I frankly think many of the Southeast Asian countries are not as aware as they ought to be of the major power competition between the US and China. Some of them are aware, but they're in denial. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the future.
When we look also at China, you speak about how China has alienated, perhaps eroded some goodwill in the region. It's geographically more or less in the backyard of Southeast Asia compared to the United States, which is so much farther away. But at the same time, as a neighbor, it doesn't have that good neighborly relations despite its high level of engagement. What would you say to China going forward? How does it capitalize, not just in terms of the financial, but in terms of being a good neighbor in a different world?
That's a great question. First, just to pick up on your point about geography, that is a very important variable for both China and the US. It's a weakness for the US because the United States is so far away. On the other hand, it's a strength for the US because it is far away from the Southeast Asian perspective. In China, it's too near. Southeast Asians, if you talk with them in a variety of countries, well, the first thing they do is always point upwards. And they talk about China, like China is up there. And China's looming over them constantly, like a big thundercloud or something. And I think, if geography were different, they would prefer to have the big power further away. But you can't change geography. What you can change is behavior, which is your real question. And there, I think China, this is an example where Southeast Asia is a harbinger of other regions of the world and a microcosm of China's challenges elsewhere in the world. Now, what do I mean by that? I think China's really got to learn to listen better, pay attention to what others are saying about it, pay attention to how others feel about it, especially others because they're all smaller than China. Southeast Asian countries are all considerably smaller than China. China, if you're going to be a big power, whether it's China, the United States, or anybody else, you have to appreciate that others are naturally suspicious of a big power, right? And secondly, you have to anticipate criticism. If you're a big power, you're going to get criticized. It just comes with the territory. We Americans are accustomed to it. We've been through 70, 80 years of criticism from all over the world. But we take it. We listen to it. We think about it and respond to it and try and engage others in whatever we're being criticized about. And then maybe, hopefully, change the behavior that led to the criticism in the first place, right? That's what Americans try and do. But I would argue China doesn't listen. China doesn't take criticism has zero tolerance for criticism. I think we're all aware of that. Wolf warrior diplomacy is just the latest example. And so in Southeast Asia, China is not very sensitive to the concerns that many of these countries, Indonesians, Malaysians, Burmese, Vietnamese, Thais, even Singaporeans have about China. Some of these anxieties are historically rooted, back to the tribute system. Some of them are buried in the minds of the older generation who lived through the 1960s and 70s, when, as I say, the Chinese Communist Party tried to support Communist Party insurgencies in every single Southeast Asian country and overthrow the existing governments in those countries. So this whole narrative about China never interfering in the internal affairs in other countries is absolute nonsense. China did throughout the 60s and the 70s, but then Deng Xiaoping came to power and he stopped that. And since then, China's been a much better neighbor in Southeast Asia. But, I think China's going to get criticized. I think it's already producing a lot of anxiety. And if China's smart, it'll listen. And it'll listen very carefully. And it will contemplate whatever the criticisms happen to be, whether it's from a Southeast Asian country or an African country or a Latin country or a European country or the United States. And then it will maybe alter its behavior a little bit. If it doesn't listen, it's a recipe really for making further mistakes,
When we
That's
look,
a great question. Yes.
and when we look also towards the Biden-Harris team, which will be coming into the White House in a couple of weeks from now, there's huge anticipation, especially about the foreign policy direction, how it will help to re-engage with the world. You spoke about U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia. What do you think we can anticipate? And perhaps what can we expect, given that we do know, of course, Joe Biden from 8 years in the White House previously?
Well, we're going to have to wait and see, first of all, who the second tier officials are that are appointed with regard to Asia in general, not just Southeast Asia. I mean, right now, all we know is the Secretary of State designate and the National Security Council Director designate. It really depends on the personnel, but I can tell you there's some very experienced people who've been working for Biden during the campaign and who we can expect will come into office. These are people who have long experience in the region, in Southeast Asia included. They understand the nuances of the region. They're not particularly ideological. And so you're going to see a re-engagement. And they're also the people who were responsible for the Obama pivot and the Obama engagement to Southeast Asia. As I said earlier, and I found in my book, that 8-year period was the best period from the Southeast Asian perspective, the best period ever in relations with the Americans. Prior to that, and since then, the Americans have been not so engaged. So I think we're going to see, in some ways, a more stepped up attention and paid by Washington to the region. We're going to have ambassadors, hopefully assigned quickly. We haven't had an ambassador in Singapore for the last 4 years. We haven't had an ambassador in Jakarta to ASEAN itself for the last 4 years. We have only had an ambassador in Bangkok for half of the last 4 years. So the Trump administration really dropped the ball on Southeast Asia. You're going to see the Biden team, I think, really prioritize Southeast Asia and get back in the game. Now, from Beijing's standpoint, that's not good news. Because Beijing has sort of had the region to itself in the last few years under Trump, I would argue, and particularly since Trump pulled out of TPP. So I think you're going to find a much more engaged United States, which is a good thing.
Of course, if you cast your mind back to the Obama White House, President Obama himself had a very strong Southeast Asian connection because his formative years were spent in Menteng, in the heart of Jakarta, in Indonesia. Joe Biden will, of course, have that legacy, even though he's made it very clear that this is not a third Obama term. But certainly there'll be some advantages coming in. As you said, he'll bring in his own team of ambassadors, which have been absent in key capitals over the last 4 years, arguably it could be an even more exciting time, and that David Shambaugh will have to write a sequel to Where Great Powers Meet.
Well, we'll have to see, James, how it all plays out. But I think it's a good thing for the region, for Southeast Asia, if the U.S. is more deeply involved than it has been over the last few years. So we'll have to continue to study it, and maybe I'll have to write a sequel to it in 4 more years.
Your first degree was over at the Elliott School at George Washington, where, of course, you now lead the China policy program. You're also a professor there more broadly. What would you tell, though, the young student, be they American or Chinese or even Southeast Asian or even Huaqiao Southeast Asian, about being prepared for the world, contributing to the world in the same mold as you have done?
I'm a full-time professor. Just finished teaching 2 classes this week. And so I interact a lot with young people, and I try and train them and stimulate them and to go into international relations and into Asian studies in particular, not just Chinese studies, Asian studies. One thing I do advise young people that are contemplating careers is that Southeast Asia is really the future. 20 years ago, people said China's the future. Got to go to China. Got to learn what's going on in China. All this buzz about China. Not today. There's not a lot of buzz. There's a lot of concern about China. I think the students that I teach and my own children's ages, there's a lot of bright horizons on the future, but you have to push yourself, and you have to be ready for challenges, because life is not easy.
About 10 years ago, I interviewed the fashion designer Diane von Furstenberg, who, of course, moved from Belgium to New York at the start of her life, her adult life. And she told me at that time that had she had a chance to do it all over again in the 2000s, then that young Diane von Furstenberg would move from Belgium to somewhere like Beijing or Shanghai. So I suppose my very last question to you would be, if David Shambaugh was an undergraduate student in the year 2020, 2021, would you choose a Southeast Asian country or a Southeast Asian region as a whole to focus your life on?
Yeah, I think I would, actually. But when I was in my 20s, China was just beginning to open and reform and was coming out of the Cultural Revolution. I first went to China in 1979 as a student. The first year it was open. I was in the first group of American students to go to China, the first year, I should say. And then I went back 1982, 83, 84, 85, 88, 89. So I spent a lot of time in China in my 20s and my 30s. It was very exciting. Everything was new. Everything was opening. Everybody was exploring new horizons in their personal lives and as a country. You could just feel it on a daily basis. It was a really great place to be as a young person. I'm not so sure that can be said today. I think we have a lot of sadness, many of us who study and have involved our lives with China, about what's going on in that country, if I'm honest with you. Whereas Southeast Asia, these countries are really dynamic and they're just taking off. They're just beginning to, they're in many ways, and the diversity, the heterogeneity of Southeast Asia, the richness, the cultural richness, intellectual richness, religious diversity, everything about the region, absolutely fascinating. And frankly, I wish I'd studied it a lot earlier, but I've discovered it later in my career. But believe me, I'm going to continue trying to understand Southeast Asia. I'll never get there. It's just too complicated. But I like puzzles, as I told you at the outset.
Well, as someone who comes from a family with very strong Southeast Asian ties, I want to thank you for taking such an interest and serious approach to the region, but also more broadly for reminding us, especially younger people, to be citizens in a world that's rapidly changing, but to also contribute as that citizen as well. Professor David Shambaugh, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure, James. Thank you, too.